has iron.
Right.
So anything that would have iron in it, would definitely kind of set it
But not
off.
anything that would naturally just be all over the floor of a dinghy.
Unless they were like gutting fish in there at one point, probably not.
Yeah, I don't know how much.
I don't even think fish would do it.
Yeah.
I'm just making a really stupid example.
Cool. Great.
Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify those two things. Sorry. Good. Let's go ahead.
So something that appeared to be blood, but it should be stated for sake of fairness that it wasn't actually totally proven to be blood.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just presumed.
Yeah, just presumed to be blood. And by the way, still no Bob.
What about Bob?
Yeah, he didn't even leave a note. Long story short, though, the police looked into it, and after an 8-month investigation, which included lots of forensic examination of the boat and dinghy, lots of interrogations of Sue, and also bugging Sue's house for a while, and also interviewing everybody she knew, she was arrested, charged with murdering Bob Chappell. And after a trial, she was sentenced to 28 years in prison. I think that was in 2010 when she was sentenced, with the possibility of parole after 18 years. It was reduced on appeal later to 23 years, 13, possibility of parole.
With a lot of what people would call rather circumstantial evidence.
Yeah, it was a pretty circumstantial case. It really was. Again, no murder weapon, no body. So, did she murder Bob? Did somebody else murder Bob? Not everybody agrees on this. Like I said, no body, no weapon.
No Bob.
Although the prosecution thinks that Sue bashed his head in with a wrench, nobody actually knows what the murder weapon was. So maybe they were dancing his head. They kind of, that's right, no body. No real smoking gun, and by that I mean there was no one thing that really incriminated Sue. It was just a lot of little things that added up. But before I get into Sue's guilt or innocence, I'm sure you all want to know what happened to the boat. Did it sink? Well, no.
Did it find a new home?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure it has by now.
We bought it.
Yeah, I know.
Just kidding.
Steal.
I'm sorry.
Around the world tour. It was taken.
That's going to be a disaster.
Oh God, no! We'd kill each other. That'd be the question. Who murdered Steve and Devin? And I would say, I don't know.
I was on shore leave.
Yeah, I was asleep, man. But or maybe who murdered Joe? And you guys would be like,
we were on shore leave.
Yeah. Back to our thing though. It was towed to a nearby dock called Constitution Dock. That's just kind of northwest of there, and north of the club. And it was kept there for a few days. I think the leaks were stopped and everything. January 28th, it was taken to a place called Clean Lift Marine and hauled out of the river for inspection. Mm-hmm. Clean Lift Marine is about maybe 5 miles north of there on the river. And on January 30th, the police were going over it, the forensics guys, and a swab was taken from the boat on the starboard deck, about amidships, which had DNA from an unknown female. Yeah, didn't match anything in the police database. But then about 6 weeks later, a 15-year-old homeless a sample of her DNA was taken and put in the database, and presto, there was a match.
Weird.
It's like that little bell in Jeopardy.
Yeah.
So Megan Voss's DNA was on the Four Winds, and this has been a big deal to this day. I saw a picture of her. She was in court just a few months ago about this whole issue, so it's still a big deal to a lot of people. We'll talk more about that in a bit. And they also found another piece of unidentified DNA on the boat, and it has never been identified, which shouldn't come as a total surprise because, according to the police, at least 21 people had been on the boat between the time it was found sinking and when the DNA samples were taken 3 days later. Mm-hmm. And that's not counting forensics personnel, by the way. And, of course, people had, I'm sure, been on the boat before. There were people that were guests or friends or whatever. Of course, they were having it worked on by various people. And
right.
So God knows whose DNA that could have been. Or it could have been, maybe a murderer. Who knows? It wasn't Sue's DNA, but yeah. So we got two pieces of DNA that, in theory, weren't supposed to be there. But Megan Voss denied that she had ever been in the Four Winds. She was very consistent about it. She was asked if she'd ever been to any of the places the boat was at, like Constitution Dock or Clean Line or Clean Lift Marine, and she said no. She said she had no idea whatsoever how it got there. And they asked her where she was the night of the murder, and she was not really sure about that either. But it turns out she was homeless, like I said, and so moving from shelter to shelter. So
it's easy to lose track of the days.
Yeah, and when she was finally questioned about this, of course, this was weeks, at least a month and a half after the murders, maybe longer than that. So
Disappearance.
Yeah,
Disappearance, not murder.
Oh yeah, sorry,
Yeah.
disappearance. Yeah.
One thing I will say is I don't know that this is what's happening here, and I'm totally like shooting from the hip again. As my disclaimer here, just remembering something that I had heard. I feel like it was maybe on like a Last Week Tonight or something like that, about a lot of forensic labs having a hard time when there are multiple people's DNA mixed, actually isolating the correct DNA profile. It would be an amazing coincidence if it just happened that they had two DNAs mixed together that provided a positive for Megan, but it's not unheard of. I mean, people have been, I believe, if I'm remembering this correctly, people have been convicted on what was presented as like hardcore DNA evidence, but there were like 5 or 6 different blood.
It was a blended mix.
Yeah, and that it just happened that, you could read certain markers as matching, and so the lab was like, yeah, it matches. Yeah. But it was really only like 2 or 3 markers. I don't know. I mean, I don't think that's what happened here, but
that would be a hell of a coincidence.
It would be a hell of a coincidence, but it's happened before. I mean, people have been convicted on evidence like that. I believe, again, disclaimer, I believe that I heard that. I might have just dreamed it. I don't know.
Yeah, that's fine. Dreams are fine. But,
they're admissible on this podcast.
No, but you bring up a good point, too, which is that DNA testing is not infallible.
Yeah.
Even though DNA is a really, really good way to identify people, that assumes that everybody's doing their job right.
Yep.
Everybody's being honest, which is not always the case. Yeah.
Sometimes there's an incentive to not be forthright that you made a mistake because that tarnishes your reputation, which then screws everything up down the line.
And so there's all kinds of different ways that you can mess up your DNA test. So we shouldn't take this as total proof that Megan Voss was on the 4 Winds. And the prosecution says she was not. Or at least they believe she wasn't. They think it's most likely it was.
So how did her DNA get there?
Well, the prosecution has said they think the most likely probable theory is that a policeman tracked it onto the yacht somehow.
So it's transference.
Yeah, transference.
It's certainly possible.
Although there's been an argument against that also.
Of course.
Yeah. But the Victoria Police Department apparently came in and reviewed the case because of all the controversy, and they looked at the DNA sample they'd taken. They said there's just, I guess, too much DNA or something like that for it to have just been a transference. It had to have been a direct application from somebody.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what they said. But again, this whole DNA thing is just there's so many ways it can get screwed up.
Yeah.
And of course, Megan Voss has been very consistent all the way along, which is not really typical. Somebody who's actually got something to highlight that, usually when they're presented with that evidence, they're like, oh yeah, well maybe I was down there, because they actually gave her an out. They said, well, it was tied up at Constitution Dock right over there. Were you over there? She could have said, yeah, I remember I was over there like being homeless one night, and I stumbled around and put my hands all over a lot of boats.
Yeah.
She didn't do that.
Yeah.
She, even though it was right near where she lived, she could have just said, yeah, I remember stumbling around over there. No doubt I touched it. She didn't do that.
Yeah.
So again, that doesn't prove that she's, absolutely innocent. Maybe she did murder. Maybe she is responsible for Bob's disappearance.
She's also 15.
She was 15 at the time of the murder. Yeah.
Just saying.
That's true. We'll talk a little bit more about Megan in a little bit here, but first let's look at the case against Sue Neal Fraser, who, like I said, has a lot of supporters down in Tasmania. The prosecution's theory of the crime is this: Bob and Sue's relationship was reaching its end. From a financial standpoint, Sue would be much better off with Bob dead and her winding up with whole ownership of all their common assets, house, boat, whatever. Rather than having to split all that stuff up with Bob, and maybe, him even getting 100% of stuff like maybe the house. I don't even know. He might have owned the house outright. I don't know.
Yeah, we don't know whose name was on what.
Apparently, they did the math on it, and they feel that Sue was significantly better off with Bob dead.
And they were not married?
They were not married.
They were just
But having been
partners.
Together, like it might have been a common law marriage if they've been together for 18
But they weren't,
years.
there was no, if they get divorced, it's half and half, divide of assets, blah, 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 blah.
No, not at all.
Okay.
Yeah, so the prosecution's theory is that on the night of January 26th, or actually the afternoon of January 26, 2009, Sue went out to the 4 Winds and murdered Bob with a blunt object down in the maid cabin, and returned to shore, went home, Later that night, she had a phone conversation with a guy named Richard King, in which King demanded to speak to Bob, and Sue said Bob was unreachable at the moment. And then after the call ended, which would have been about 10:35 p.m., Sue became worried that King might go down to the Four Winds himself and discover the body, so she drove down to the waterfront, went out to the boat in the dinghy, winched Bob's body out of the cabin. The boat had a winch on it. And so she used the winch to winch it out of the cabin, or at least to help her get the body out of the cabin.
To lift it out.
Yeah, it's a little helping hand there. And
dead weight is not easy to move.
No, definitely. And so having that little extra would probably have done the trick for her. Then their theory is she tied the body to put the body into the dinghy, tied it to that large, heavy fire extinguisher that I mentioned earlier to weigh it down. Took it somewhere down the river to deeper water, because they searched the river pretty carefully with divers and everything. We're not able to find it. And dumped the body, then went back to the boat to clean it up and get rid of as much evidence as possible. So, pieces of carpet had been removed and stuff like this. And so, somebody did try to at least get rid of some of the evidence, although not all of it. And then she also attempted, of course, to sink the boat. And according to this, is also part of their theory, only Sue or Bob would have been familiar enough with the plumbing on that boat to be able to do what she did. Unless somebody happened to come...
What they allege she did.
What they alleged that she did. Unless whoever came aboard the boat and murdered Bob really knew a lot about boats.
Which is possible.
I mean, Joe knows enough about boats.
Well, but even me, if I go to the forward head and you say to me, Joe, slash the intake line, I wouldn't know which one was the intake line.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I really wouldn't.
Fair enough, yeah.
Yeah, you have to actually know your own boat to know that stuff,
yeah.
probably.
And sorry, I don't think we talked about this. What was the Sue and Bob? Were they big people? Was she big? Was he big? I mean,
they
were
they comparable size
height.
to each other?
They were
both
average
of them?
height and weight.
They were average height, and they seemed to be reasonably similar in size. Yeah, he was not a huge guy, and she was not a tiny, petite woman.
Okay, great.
So, yeah.
Just is it even reasonable for her to have, been able to even move his body at all?
Mm-hmm. I think that, on a sailboat, you do have winches all over the place that have to pull heavy stuff like pull anchors up or pull sails.
Right, but you do have to get a body to a place where you can get the winch. I mean,
Oh yeah. Well, that's what those rub marks in the hatches theorized came from.
Is the rope.
The rope goes down, she ties it around his chest or something like that, and then starts winching it up. And I'm sure it would have been a kind of brutally hard job. I mean, obviously she didn't plan the crime as carefully as she probably should have.
I also guess I just have a problem with she's the one who pointed the rope marks out, and if she had caused them with the winch dragging,
she kept her mouth shut.
She would have, yeah.
That's one possibility. She would have kept her mouth shut. I don't know if that was maybe her trying to get out ahead of the whole thing, and just
it was dumb if she did. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, it was dumb. I mean, I think, but again, I've seen other cases where people point stuff out to the police that later incriminated them, and it's like I really do think that it's either maybe arrogance or maybe they're just trying to get ahead. They don't want the police to point to this and say to you, "What's this?" and have you look all guilty. Instead, you just say, "Hey, wow, what's that, policeman?" And so that's
dumb.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
But anyway, I never said Sue was brilliant.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, anyway, back to the prosecution.
So yeah, what do they say? Let's finish this up.
Oh yeah. So she scuttles the boat, or at least attempts to. Then takes the dinghy back to shore, casts it adrift, goes home. At 3:08 a.m., she made a 10-pound call at her landline. So that's 10 pound. And apparently in Australia, what that does is it tells you the number of the last incoming call that you received.
Okay.
It's like, what do we have for here that we used to have before? Was it star 69? Yeah. Same thing. This is the prosecution's theory.
Why did she do a 10-pound?
I think she wanted to see because she was going to tell the police that she was home all night. Now, if somebody had been trying to call her,
I see.
Yeah, and her last call was an incoming call from Richard King.
Great.
So if she 10 pounds it, and that's the call, then hey,
okay. Got it.
Bingo. Yeah. Okay. But anyway, the prosecution's theory seems reasonable enough, but how to convince a jury of this? Because remember, that can't just be kind of reasonable. It's got to be beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah, because, theoretically, she could have woken up in the middle of the night, thought the phone had rang and had missed it, and so hit 10 pounds to see, if she had truly missed it or
Sure.
she just dreamed it.
Nothing, maybe she was taking a midnight shower and just thought, I thought I heard the phone ring.
A little 3 a.m. showering.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's very common.
Yeah, all the time, I know. Well, first, what were Sue's whereabouts after she parted ways with Bob on the afternoon of January 26th? Well, okay, she says she went to shore, tied up her dinghy, got into her car, and went to Bunnings, which is the Australian version of Home Depot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she browsed for a long time, but didn't buy anything, then went home. Bob and Sue lived on Allison Street, which is about 2 miles from the Royal Yacht Club. It's about 1.5 miles as the crow flies, but by street, if you walk it, drive it, it's 2 miles.
It's never a straight line.
Yeah. Sue said it was getting dark when she got home, so that would be late because sunset in Hobart that day was at 8:41 p.m. And after she got home, she made 2 phone calls, and then she received that 10:05 phone call from Richard King that I mentioned before.
Mm-hmm.
And she was home the rest of the night until she was phoned by police the next morning at 7:11 a.m. And she drove down to the Royal Yacht Club right away. And that's on the 27th, that's what she told police. And this story, of course, did change a bit over time, as you guys may or may not know.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But that same morning, the owner of a house at 2 Margaret Street found a red jacket on the brick wall outside his house. And you can see this house on Google Street View. They drove past it. To lay this out for you, Marieville Esplanade runs north-south and parallel to the shoreline. And at the north end of it, near the north end of it, at right angles, there is Margaret Street that goes off of it. It tees into it. And so this house was just right off of Marieville Esplanade. And this and where the jacket was found is about 150 yards from where Sue had tied up the dinghy the night before.
Right.
We had the ladder in the Royal Yacht Club. Police showed the jacket to Sue. She said she'd never seen it before. But it turns out she had. In fact, it actually belonged to her.
Which is weird.
Yeah, I don't know why she didn't just own up to it. I don't quite get that. But she said she'd never seen it before. Also noticed that she had apparently injured her wrist and her thumb. She had a bandage on her thumb, and her wrist had been strapped, like she'd been sprained, maybe.
Oh.
Like with an ace bandage kind of strapped, I'm guessing is what that means.
Yeah. And it turns out, remember I mentioned that photo was taken at lunch the day before? Well, her hands were visible in the photo, and she didn't have any bandages or strapping or anything.
Or obvious wounds.
So something had happened, over the course of that less than 24 hours to injure her. Like maybe moving a body. Oh, sorry. She also, at that time, unprompted. Now remember, this is meeting the police down there. She's been told.
This is the day of.
The morning of. And she's been told, well, the boat's sinking. She shows up, the police are there, and she said that the Four Winds had been boarded by somebody 2 or 3 days before. And she said she was concerned that drug smugglers had perhaps hidden drugs on the boat.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, there you go. She talked about maybe them getting some sniffer dogs and sniffing the boat to see if there were drugs on it.
No, I've never seen that jacket before. It's the drugs. I swear it's the drugs. It's got to be the drugs.
I'm really
right?
not talking really fast because I'm on drugs, but you should look for some drugs.
You should look for some drugs, yeah. There may be some drugs on there. I don't know.
It's all the drug runners, yeah.
Smugglers, that's what's done it. It's smugglers.
That's it, yeah. So, get those dogs on my boat right now.
Well,
Kids, we're not advocating drugs. Don't do drugs.
Don't do drugs.
Yeah, I think at this point, there was no suggestion of foul play even. I mean, they didn't even actually know that Bob was missing at this point in time. And so,
it's weird.
She's like going on, it was weird. She said some weird stuff.
But people do.
Well, sure. I mean, and that's not obviously a hanging offense, unless you say too much weird stuff, and then it is. But Sue had another interview with the police on February 5th, which would be 10 days after Bob went missing. She did repeat what she said about going to Bunnings after leaving Bob, and then a month later she repeated that claim again to police, but at this point they had a chance to check out the CCTV, that's closed-circuit television, from the store, and they couldn't find her anywhere. And they said, gee, Sue, we can't find you on any CCTV from the store. And also, by the way, Sue, did you know that Bunnings closes at 6 p.m. that day?
That's weird because they let me in.
It's the drugs. It's not the drugs.
Yeah, I was wondering why there's nobody there. I was wondering why it was dark. I was wondering why I had to
service in that place sucks.
And then at that point she said, well, she was pretty sure she'd gone there that day. And then in that same interview, she also repeated that she'd been home all night, the night of January 26th to 27th.
Man, okay, so I have a really bad memory, as you guys know. I don't think I have even this bad of a memory. I mean, maybe like a year
Oh, sure, a
right?
year for sure, but a day before?
Yeah, a day before, like, I don't know what I did yesterday. I don't know. Maybe she was drunk. Maybe she had gotten
Actually, okay,
sloshed.
listen. If she is under a lot of stress, if this project is stressing her out and Bob is stressing her out and something else is, and she is just not handling things well. Plus, I seem to also remember somewhere in the reading that she was on some medication that could have a side effect of messing with your memory.
Yeah, I think she was on Xanax or something like that.
Yeah, so it is possible that did go